You are not reading this by chance. Something in you already senses that the official narrative doesn't close, that the pieces don't fit together, that there are silences louder than any speech. I am here because I learned to listen to these silences. And today I'm going to show you what has always been before your eyes, but has been hidden beneath layers of habit, fear, and repetition. Look around now, not with your eyes, but with suspicion. Choose any environment: a meeting room, a family table, a cult, a banal conversation. 10 people breathe there. 9 live in a state that the ancients would call torpor of the soul. They don't choose, they react. They don't think, they imitate. They carry inherited beliefs as if they were revealed truths, but they never asked where they came from, who wrote them, or who they serve. I spent years comparing texts, tracking down versions, looking at the footnotes to history, the ones no one reads. And I can say what you call life, most of the time, is just a script. There is always an exception, however. A present body that is not completely captured. He observes instead of justifying himself. He listens to the pauses and not just the words. He notices the gesture that betrays the speech, the emotion that leaks behind the smile. I know this type of man because I had to become one of them to survive what I found in the forgotten archives, in the amputated doctrines, in the crossed-out passages of the manuscripts. They don't seek approval, they seek leverage. They do not ask for permission from chaos, they operate within it. Maybe you still believe that you work hard and therefore deserve to prosper, that being good is protection, that telling the truth always generates justice. This childish faith was not born in you. It was planted, fueled by centuries of edited morals, of hand-picked canons, of sanctified omissions. When I began to confront ancient versions of religious texts, I noticed that the parts most dangerous to the established order were always softened or deleted. The religion you know has not just been revealed. She was shaped. If you have never questioned why certain books disappeared, why certain concepts were replaced by docile metaphors, why faith was dissociated from lucidity, then you are still stuck in the plot others have written for you. And am not here to comfort. Am here to break through. Machiavelli, as demonized as he is misread, was not a destroyer of ethics. He was an attentive reader of reality. He did what the ancient scribes did. He described the world as it is, not as it should be. And that made him dangerous. Because when someone stops projecting virtue onto human flesh, they start to see patterns that can no longer be ignored. You have been trained to confuse kindness with vulnerability, confusing faith with passivity, confusing humility with invisibility. I saw, in erased versions of ancient treatises, the same warning echo in different cultures. Anyone who depends on their own purity to survive in an impure world is not a martyr, they are an offering. How many times have you wondered why you always end up hurt when you trust too much? Why does it seem like the loudest ones go up the fastest? Because those who manipulate prosper. You call it injustice. I call it a lack of symbolic reading of reality. People are not what they say. They are what they gain from acting. This rule crosses manuscripts, empires, and pulpits. Even the most seemingly selfless gesture carries an invisible currency. Recognition, control, moral power, spiritual dopamine. I don't tell you this to make you bitter. I tell you to free yourself. If this is already opening a rift inside you, write now in the comments where you are watching. Not for engagement, but as a first gesture of conscious presence. You are not a number. Not yet. There is a reason why ancient texts warned against naivety as a spiritual vice. It is not evil that destroys civilizations, but the inability to see evil when it wears a robe of virtue. I needed to relearn how to read between the lines to understand that justice is not a natural force, it is a human agreement. Power, on the contrary, is as organic as hunger. As long as you believe that the world will treat you with the same ethics that you carry, you walk naked in a land of predators. But when you abandon moral expectation, something changes. The veil tears. Phrases no longer matter more than gestures. The apology loses weight when faced with the repetition of the damage. The promise gives way to the standard. I'm not inviting you to become cruel. I am calling you to become lucid. Crossing the portal that separates feeling from understanding. Because only after that do you stop being a character and start to get closer to the author. But be careful. There is a price. When you start to see the wires, you can no longer pretend you don't see them. Every meeting, every conversation, every relationship starts to carry hidden layers that previously went unnoticed. Comfort disappears. Innocence dies. And in its place is born something that tradition tried to hide: inner sovereignty. If you want to continue on this path, not as a spectator, but as an initiate, then stay until the end of this series. What follows is not motivation. It's a disassembly. And the first gear we are going to expose is the most painful of all: the belief that the world owes you something. You may have closed the video for a few seconds after the first part. Maybe he took a deep breath. Maybe you thought I was exaggerating, that all of this sounds too intense for the ordinary life you lead between bills, queues, and elevator conversations. But that's exactly where the mechanism hides: in the banal, in the automatic, in the habit that anesthetizes perception. I'm not talking about distant conspiracies. I'm talking about the small daily betrayal that you commit against yourself without realizing it. I remember a woman I met in a public hospital waiting room. She clutched an envelope to her chest as if holding her own identity. Inside were exams, years of work, reports that no one read properly. The doctor called her by her last name, barely looked up, repeated memorized phrases, and in 5 minutes decided her future. She left thanking him. Thanking you for not being humiliated. Thanking you for being served. He didn't question anything. He did not ask why each choice was made. Accepted. When I saw her walking away down the hallway, I thought of the ancient manuscripts that describe obedience as the most efficient form of domination. It's not the whip that keeps the herd together. It's the conviction that there is no alternative. It's like that at work when you accept overload because you're afraid of appearing ungrateful. It's like that in relationships when you swallow disloyalty because everyone makes mistakes. It's like this in the family when you silence a truth to maintain superficial harmony. You call it maturity. I call it the modern ritual of self-erasure. Meanwhile, those who have learned to read the subtext act differently. They do not enter into a conversation thinking about how they should be treated, but by observing how they are actually treated. They don't ask for justice, they analyze gain. They don't ask, how could you do this to me? But what did you gain by doing this to me? This question changes everything, because it takes you out of the emotional center and places you on the strategic periphery, where the board is visible. I remember a guy who worked with me years ago. He was the most dedicated on the team, arriving before everyone else, leaving later, solving problems that weren't his. When the company needed to cut costs, he was the first to be fired. The manager explained that he was very good, but not essential. He left confused, with a speech of gratitude on his lips and silent humiliation on his shoulders. Months later, I met the promoted manager. Not because it was better, but because it was necessary for someone higher up. This type of scene is repeated so much that it should be studied as a liturgy in the corporate world. The texts I have compared over the years speak of this in a raw way. Do not project your ethics onto human nature. The mistake is not in being good, it is in believing that kindness is shielding. You don't need to become cynical, you need to become attentive. The person who compliments you may be pushing you off center. The friend who advises you not to take risks may be protecting his own mediocrity. The institution that says we are a family is almost always preparing a cold dismissal. Perhaps you are now remembering a specific episode, a betrayal that made no sense, an unexpected cut, a silence that came after a promise. Don't ask anymore how this was possible. Ask what was gained from it. What changed for each other after you left the scene? Status, peace of mind, control, energy saving. It doesn't matter. There is always an invisible profit. And haste the twist that few accept: when you abandon the fantasy that the world should act according to your moral code, you don't lose humanity, you gain vision. It's like adjusting the focus of an old lens. Suddenly, You no longer feel personally attacked by every injustice because you understand the pattern behind the gesture. This does not cure the pain, but it prevents it from recurring in the same place. The other day, I observed a banal argument in a cafe. A couple was arguing in low voices. She explained, with long sentences and nervous gestures, why she was hurt. He shook his head, but his body was already somewhere else. He looked at his cell phone, looked away, breathed impatiently. When she finished, he apologized and changed the subject. I later learned that they broke up and that he already had someone else. She was shocked. I am not. His body had spoken everything before the words. If you keep listening to speeches and ignoring movements, you will continue to confuse signals. But if you learn to read actions as if they were fragments of a torn manuscript, you will begin to reconstruct the truth behind the official narrative of your own life. There is nothing mystical about it. It's almost banal. But the banal is where the thickest veils hide. You don't need to run away to a monastery or study dead languages to wake up. Just stop asking the world to be fair and start seeing it as it behaves. This is the second portal. And going through it hurts because it dismantles your innocence. What comes next will not be comfortable. Because now that you suspect your own kindness as a shield, I'm going to show you the tool that makes even the most cunning reveal themselves without realizing it. It requires neither confrontation nor eloquence. It just requires something that most have lost the ability to remain silent when everything in you wants to explain itself. Have you ever noticed how the world has become too noisy for anyone to think in silence? Screens flicker, notifications vibrate, people talk so they can't hear themselves. When I began studying ancient versions of texts that almost no one consults, I found a curious pattern. Every tradition that taught the power of withdrawal ended up being rewritten to exalt public confession, loud testimony, emotional exposure. Silence came to be seen as suspicious, almost as a sin. But those who live in silence inside see what the noise hides. In a company where I worked, there was an employee who rarely spoke in meetings. He wrote down everything, observed the power plays, did not get involved in open disputes. While others fought for space, he moved beneath the surface, accumulating small, invisible victories. Months later, when the board changed, he was the one who assumed a strategic position. Nobody understood how that happened. I understood because I saw him using emptiness as an instrument, not as an absence. Silence is not a lack of response. It is the creation of a space where the other reveals itself. When you don't rush to fill the pause, other people's minds go into disarray and try to reorganize themselves. In this effort, he delivers information that would never be said under direct pressure. I saw this happen in banal conversations, in negotiations, in unexpected confessions. It's not magic, it's primitive psychology. Have you ever spent a few seconds without responding to someone and noticed the discomfort this causes? Have you ever noticed how people start justifying what they said, explaining themselves too much, revealing intentions that weren't on the surface? Modern culture has trained you to believe that explaining is a virtue, that defending yourself is maturity, that responding quickly is a sign of intelligence. But every word you say to protect yourself is a piece of your internal map that you give to the world. Each justification is an emotional coordinate. What I learned by comparing ancient doctrines is that the initiate does not speak to get rid of tension, he sustains the tension until she reveals the truth. I remember a time when I was publicly accused of something I hadn't done. Everyone expected me to react, to raise my voice, to prove my innocence. I didn't do any of that. I just listened and remained silent. The person accusing me began to get confused, repeated the story with small changes, added details that had never been mentioned. Within minutes, everyone realized the inconsistency. I didn't need to defend myself. The void did the work for me. The strangest thing is that, after that, I started to be treated with more respect. Not because I became more aggressive, but because I stopped showing where it hurt. People don't know how to deal with people who don't bleed in front of them. Silence creates an aura of unpredictability that no speech can create. How many times have you tried to explain your reasons and left the conversation smaller than you entered it? How many times have you felt that the more you spoke, the weaker you seemed? There is also another effect, less commented on. When you reduce your words, you begin to hear the world more accurately. Notice microgestures, changes in tone, strange pauses. Start reading not only what is said, but what is avoided. In the oldest religious texts, silence was not just discipline, it was a method of revelation. The truth was not imposed, it emerged when the noise stopped. At a bar table, you can test this today. When someone finishes a sentence, don't rush it. Look into the eyes, breathe, wait. At some point, the person will try to save the conversation and say something that wasn't planned. It could be an insecurity, a contradiction, an unresolved desire. There is the living manuscript that no one studies, the biography that was not written. What few realize is that this practice also transforms your relationship with yourself. When you stop explaining, you start listening. Discover impulses that were previously hidden behind the habit of speaking. He realizes that much of his anxiety came from the fear of not being understood. And when that fear subsides, something rare happens. You become less manipulable, because you no longer need to prove who you are. Do you remember the last time you remained silent even though you wanted to justify yourself? What appeared inside you at that moment? In the next movement of this journey, I will take you into even more delicate territory, where silence is no longer enough. Because, after you learn to remain silent, a new need arises, learning to appear human in a strategic way, without ever giving away what is really going on in the center of your mind. Once you learn to use silence, you discover something disturbing. It is not enough to cross the world without leaving a trace. Pure silence creates respect, but it also creates fear. And where there is fear, the desire to destroy before being destroyed is born. That's what I noticed when observing figures that dominated entire rooms just by not reacting. Some of them disappeared too quickly, swallowed up by intrigues they never understood. They didn't fall because they talked too much, but because they seemed unreachable. The error was not in the absence of words, but in the absence of visible humanity. I met a company director who never raised his voice, never explained himself, never made mistakes in public. He was too efficient, too clean, too impenetrable. For months he was admired. Then he began to be feared. Rumors soon arose, vague accusations, inflated stories. No one had concrete proof, but everyone had the feeling that he was hiding something. In less than a year, he was removed. When I met him later, he told me something simple: I didn't know how to look ordinary anymore. That phrase stayed with me like a warning inscribed in stone. The texts I have analyzed throughout my life show that every initiate learns early that public perfection is a trap. Ancient traditions spoke of teachers who deliberately revealed small flaws so as not to arouse hatred. It's not about lying about who you are, it's about choosing what to show. The right vulnerability, in the right dose, dismantles the other's predatory instinct. When someone realizes that you also carry a doubt, a minimal insecurity, a banal imperfection, their mind relaxes. Confrontation is no longer a priority. Surveillance drops. I've used this in situations where any mistake would be costly. In a difficult negotiation, I asked a question that I already knew the answer to. I showed hesitation over something irrelevant. The person on the other side smiled, assumed the role of expert and, without realizing it, revealed exactly where he intended to press. The detail I was looking for came like a gift wrapped in vanity. I didn't need to force anything. All it took was allowing the other person's ego to feel bigger for a few minutes. This happens in even simpler contexts. Think about a family conversation. When you admit a little tiredness or a slight doubt, people stop seeing you as a threat and start treating you as part of the group. But if you reveal everything, if you expose your deep pain, if you give away the core of your identity, you become predictable. And predictability is the cheapest material in manipulation. There is a little-known story about a diplomat from the beginning of the last century who survived 3 opposing political regimes. He didn't change his values, but he changed his stance. In one context, it was rigid and formal. In another, he became approachable and cordial. in another, almost invisible. When asked what his true personality was, he replied, "The one who keeps my mission alive." This phrase didn't make it into the history books, but it carries more wisdom than many treatises. Modern culture has romanticized the idea of authenticity as if it were an absolute virtue. Be yourself, they repeat. But no one says that you changes depending on the terrain. What works at home destroys you at work. What works among friends can expose you in competitive environments. This is not about falsehood, but about reading the context. An actor who refuses to change costumes is not being truthful, he is being incompetent. It took me a while to understand this. For years I carried the conviction that it was enough to be coherent, transparent, and direct. I lost opportunities, I wasted alliances, I provoked unnecessary resistance. Only when I began to observe how ancient leaders moved in hostile environments did I realize the pattern. They didn't hide the essence, but protected it with layers. Layers of cordiality, of controlled doubt, of selected humanity. There is also a curious psychological effect. When you show yourself to be a little flawed, the other person projects superiority. And when someone feels superior, they stop examining you. It's like an animal that lets its guard down when it believes its prey poses no risk. At that moment, you are no longer a target, you are a backdrop. And it is in the background that those who do not want to be seen move. Perhaps you remember someone who always seems friendly, approachable, even fragile, but who inexplicably reaches positions of power. It's no coincidence. It's silent calculation. These people never show everything. They never offer their whole heart. They manage the image like an ancient librarian managed rare parchments. Only a few volumes remain on the table. The rest remain locked. This strategy is not about beating others. It is about surviving them. Because the world doesn't just punish those who make mistakes. It punishes those who don't protect themselves. If you become too opaque, you become a threat. If it becomes too transparent, it becomes an appeal. The balance is appearing human without becoming vulnerable, appearing ordinary without becoming disposable. And hey, race the twist that almost no one accepts. You don't owe the world unrestricted access to your soul. There are parts of you that are not public, not negotiable, not fodder for applause or attack. They are the center that supports everything else. Those who give up this center too soon spend the rest of their lives trying to get it back. In the next step, this logic goes beyond the image and enters the most dangerous field of all conflict relationships. Because, after you learn to silence and camouflage yourself, you need to decide what to do when those who don't want you well appear. That's where the story stops being about defense and becomes about transforming attack into strength. Once you learn to silence and wear the right mask, something inevitable happens. You begin to attract opposition. Not because he became aggressive, but because he stopped being predictable. People don't feel threatened by those who talk too much or explain themselves all the time. They feel threatened by those who observe, change their posture depending on the environment, and do not offer maps of their own mind. It is at this point that enemies appear, sometimes disguised as constructive criticism, sometimes as irony, sometimes as sudden withdrawal. I remember a phase where everything seemed to flow too well. Projects moving forward, stable relationships, less emotional exhaustion. Until a strange comment began to be repeated in different places. A vague phrase here, a doubt planted there. Nothing direct. Nothing that could be confronted. It was the kind of hostility that doesn't want to win, it wants to corrode. Took me a while to understand that this was not a problem to be eliminated, but a signal to be deciphered. When you enter this stage, the most common mistake is trying to pacify. Ask for explanations, offer conciliation, prove good intentions. This only teaches the other person that you still react, that it still hurts. The pattern I found in old reports is different. The attack must not be denied, it must be absorbed. Each review becomes an audit. Every rumor becomes a mirror. Not to believe everything, but to investigate where the armor is still thin. I knew a musician who was ridiculed for playing in a weird way. He could have abandoned his style to fit in, but he decided to intensify what was a reason for attack. He studied more, refined his technique, made the defect apparent in his signature. Years later, it was precisely that strangeness that distinguished him. The same people who mocked him now cited his name as a reference. He didn't defeat the enemy, he transformed the enemy into strength. This also applies to the simplest everyday life. A colleague who criticizes your slowness may be pointing out a real focus problem. A family member who mocks your ambitions may be revealing their own fear of trying. Not every attack is valid, but every attack contains data. The secret is not to defend yourself, it is to filter. What of this scam can be converted into a tool? There is a strange tension when you decide not to move out of a desire for acceptance. People who are used to having your attention start demanding explanations from you. You look different, they say. They're right. You are less available for predictable games. This creates unexpected reactions, sudden departures, invitations that disappear, looks that change tone. It's like you've broken an invisible contract. And in a way it broke. The contract must always be the same to make it easier for others to read. A friend told me that, after he started studying at night in silence while everyone else went out, he began to be called arrogant. He didn't feel that way. He was just tired of being scattered. But the group needed his presence to maintain the old balance. When he changed, the system reacted. That's when he understood that growing isn't just about adding skills, it's about removing dependencies. There is a phase where everything seems to turn against you. Not because you took the wrong path, but because you are leaving an old layer of identity. This phase is scary because it feels like a collective loss. Fewer messages, fewer invitations, less certainty. But it is also the phase in which you begin to perceive time as an ally. While others react to the day, you begin to build weeks. While others think in months, you start thinking in years. This change of horizon creates a silent difference. Most want quick results, immediate recognition, comfort now. You start to ask what it will cost later. A car that compromises income, an impulsive response that creates a lasting enemy, a brief pleasure that sabotages a long project. It's not moral, it's calculation. It's not a sacrifice, it's an investment. I met a man who spent 5 years studying for a career change while holding down a job he hated. No one around believed him. They laughed when he refused invitations. They mocked him when he said little about his plans. In 6th year, he left without fanfare. In less than 12 months, I was in another city, another role, another standard of living. To those who saw it from the outside, it looked like luck. For him, it was just the harvest of prolonged silence. The world tries to convince you that patience is passivity. It is not. Patience is a form of resistance. Resist the urge to explain yourself, to show off, to compare yourself, to rush. Every time you hold a reaction, you are accumulating energy. Every time you postpone a pleasure for something greater, you are doubling your bet on the future. But there is a risk here, and it approaches without warning. When you start winning from within, the temptation to feel superior arises. It's subtle. A feeling that you now see what others don't, which is above the game. This is the most dangerous moment of all, because it prepares the fall. The ego loves exception narratives. He whispers that you don't need to learn anymore, that you already understand everything. I've seen it destroy brilliant people. People who went through chaos with discipline, but stumbled over their own vanity. They began to treat criticism as ignorance, warnings as envy. They stopped adjusting the route. When they realized, they were surrounded by echoes, not truths. This is why every serious tradition speaks of continuous inner vigilance. There is no finish line. Now, as you hear these words, you may be wondering where this all leads. What really changes when you stop reacting, exposing yourself too much, trying to please, fearing enemies, chasing the now? The answer is not an external achievement. It's a kind of internal freedom that few experience. And it doesn't come as euphoria, it comes as stability. That's what we'll talk about next. Because in the last movement of this journey, you will not learn a new technique, but a different way of using what you already feel every day: anger, frustration, pain, tiredness. What used to drain you will become raw material. And that's where the game really changes. We have reached the point where it is no longer enough to understand. Understanding is comfortable. Understanding does not change habits. What changes a life is the gesture repeated in silence, away from applause and distraction. Everything we've been through so far, the silence that reveals, the mask that protects, the use of opposition as strength, time as an ally only makes sense when you start to apply it to your common routine, in that part of the day when no one is looking. The first practice is simple, but requires discipline. Over the next week, talk less than usual. Not to sound mysterious, but to listen with real attention. In meetings, let others explain themselves. In difficult conversations, take a breath before responding. Use mindful pauses. The goal is not to beat anyone, it is to observe patterns. Make a mental note of who rushes to fill the void, who changes their version of their own story, who reveals more when they don't find a reaction. This is the laboratory where you begin to read the world as an open text. The second practice is to protect your center. Choose a part of your life that no one needs to know in detail. Could be a project, a plan, a change you want to make. Don't advertise, don't seek approval, don't ask for validation. Work on it every day for a few minutes, even when you are tired. You will realize that the less people know, the more energy you will have to move forward. It's not isolation, it's cultivation. The third practice is to turn attacks into data. The next criticism you receive, don't automatically defend yourself. Ask yourself, in silence, what can be used there? Is there a standard? Is there a real weak point? Is there just a projection of the other? This screening prevents you from bleeding for nothing and teaches you to use discomfort as a map. The fourth practice is to lengthen your time. Before making impulsive decisions, project yourself 5 years ahead. Imagine looking at the current moment as if you were reading an old page in your history. Will what you are about to do make you proud or embarrass you? This simple question cuts out dozens of wrong choices. The fifth practice is to take care of your own strength without guilt. Say no when necessary. Sleep better. Eat more carefully. Organize your finances, even if it's just a little at a time. Not out of selfishness, but out of responsibility. You cannot sustain anything in the world if you are collapsing inside. Now comes the most delicate point. All of this only works if you learn to transmute what you feel. When something hurts you, don't rush to anesthetize it. Don't throw away the energy of the moment. Use it. Go walk, write, study, train, plan. Make emotion raw material. Over time, you will realize that what used to paralyze you starts to move you. Maybe you're thinking that this is too difficult, that it demands more of you than you're willing to give. But remember, no one asked you to change everything today. Just to start observing. Just to take the first step away from automatism. The rest is built like an invisible staircase, step by step. I don't promise you comfort. I promise clarity. And clarity changes everything. When you start to see the game, you stop feeling like a victim and start seeing yourself as the perpetrator. Not from a grand plot, but from the silent narrative that shapes your choices every day. If this video touched on something that you had never been able to name, if any phrase resonated in there, like it now so that this content reaches other people who also need to wake up. Write in the comments from where you are watching, even if anonymously, just to mark that you were present at this moment. And subscribe to the channel to continue this journey. What you learned here today doesn't end with the video. It starts now, in how you will get through the next conversation, the next decision, the next silence.